It's been around a year since I published my initial scathing review of Lords of the Fallen, which was the first video on my channel that really blew up. And I'd like to say to all of you who've been subscribed since then that I truly appreciate all of your support. Making these videos takes a ton of time, effort, and stress. However, it's all worth it at the end of the day when I get those moments of success. And it's all thanks to each and every one of you who takes the time to hit the like, share with a friend, or comment that I'm fat and stupid. The funny thing about that first big break video is that I never would have made it if I would have received a refund for the broken mess of a dogshit copycat title that Lords of the Fallen was. And I think that one thing that people misunderstood quite frequently while watching that video is that I never expected a refund, nor even assumed I deserved one. I played the entire game, even despite the fact that the entire game was shit minus some small details I pointed out throughout. And so my decision to make that review all hinged entirely on a mental wager I made with the universe. If I received the very generous but fair refund for a game I was entirely unsatisfied with, then the industry would have proved itself to be consumer forward, in a similar way to the massive refunds that was given in the wake of Cyberpunk's terrible flop of a release. However, unfortunately for the developers of Lords of the Fallen, I did not receive a similar refund, and so I set myself to create that highly critical review that pointed out every single instance of lazy asset reuse, the critical failures of the game's engine, and the confused design choices of the game's mechanics. A review which was viewed by 250,000 people, and hopefully made many of those viewers rethink a potential purchase of this garbage title. At the end of the day, the whole experience of creating that video and seeing it blow up, which allowed me to monetize my content and receive compensation for my efforts as a critic instead of receiving a refund, was a hugely cathartic moment for me. And so when a viewer commented on my recent video that I should take another look at Lords of the Fallen and take apart the various updates made to the game over the last year, I felt very motivated to oblige that request. Thank you so much for the suggestion. Now, after skimming through a year's worth of patch notes, there only really seemed to be a handful of significant changes. My apologies for not burying the lead on that one, it's kinda hard to avoid. Around 90% of all of the changes revolve around patching exploits or glitches, and more significantly, optimizing the game, such as a pass that addressed NPC cloth effects, aiming to reduce the total load on the game in small ways. And that's great news. After a year of hard work and dedication, Hexwork has finally made a game that runs like shit. Still runs like shit. Now let's be clear here. The game barely managing to maintain 10 frames a second is pretty shitty. But if you know this title, then you know that it's just the cherry on top of the diarrhea sundae. There are far greater issues here than poor performance, and yet, after a year of effort and a majority of their patches revolving around optimization, the devs couldn't even get their game's performance to a less than embarrassing level. Honestly, you could fix this within a single patch that de-rendered everything down to a Roblox-esque level, and the game would still suck ass, because everything else is poorly made as well. You would then simply have a game that runs well but features 6 enemy types reskinned 100 times that you'll fight with basic trash combat. But let's push all that to the side for now and focus on the few significant changes made to the game so far. You have a couple new spells, weapons, and armor sets, all jammed into the game, already bloated with shit nobody is using because the game isn't fun. And you have the new modifier system. And hold on a second, because this is actually a great idea. A great idea because it was already a great idea when Halo did it 20 years ago. Lords of the Fallen has added Halo's skull modifiers into their game, even calling their version of the Iron Skull the Iron Man modifier, which I really hope is a reference and not a coincidence or instance of cryptonesia. Make no mistake, the addition of skull modifiers is a really good idea for a Souls game. The skulls in Halo have always acted as a unique way to add diversity to the gameplay and replayability to the content, resulting in the universally understood term lasso, which I hope I don't have to explain means legendary difficulty, all skulls on. This type of playthrough is a gruelingly difficult challenge run which features a good bit of change from your standard run of a Halo campaign, and yet can be understood by Halo fans with the simple community-strengthening 4-letter acronym LASSO. I absolutely think that there's room in Souls for a more standardized challenge run format similar to Halo Skulls. The terms SL1, RL1, no-hit run, bow only, deathless, randomized run, and various others have all become staples of Souls content creators, and I believe that these concepts could easily be reformatted to be in-game concepts with appropriate in-game rewards for completing them. There's no doubt in my mind that the skull modifier style of content could absolutely work well within a Souls game. However, that would entirely rely on the game itself being worth playing in the first place. And the hilarious thing about Lords of the Fallen's new modifiers is that they each directly highlight a massive failure of the game in their own way. So let's take apart each of them, which will essentially make up the focus of this video, because it's really the only thing of note that has been added in the last year. And at this point you might be asking, after taking a year off from this game, what gives me the expertise to speak about this new content? What experience could I possibly have learned within a brief revisit to this game that I fucking hate? Well, for the sake of this video, I've completed a lasso run of this game, with each and every modifier turned on, which included Iron Man, which restarts your game upon a death, randomized enemies, randomized loot, healing items only giving withered health, increased enemy density, pre-upgraded loot, which is the only positive one, and complete vestige decay, which entirely eliminates the permanent bonfires, forcing you to use vestige seeds the whole game. Now, did I have to do each and every modifier at once in order to understand their function? No, I obviously did not. But did I have to do it in order to obtain a diamond achievement? Also no, there's only achievements for specific pairings of modifiers, the hardest likely being the combination of Iron Man and withered health. But you'll get full access to bonfires, nerfed enemy density, and predictable enemy and loot spawns. But fuck that, I did that with all of them on because I hate myself. But also, it really wasn't all that hard, because the game is bad. I feel like I say this a lot when it comes to Souls-likes, but honestly the hardest aspect of this challenge run is turning the game on at all. It's really boring, and the individual challenges themselves within the run are mostly just tedious busy work, while the boss fights are a complete joke across the board. So let's get into this by starting with the Iron Man modifier, which resets your game after a full death while umbral. This is the most direct challenge of the modifiers, and the only one that really represents a complete run with the final goal at the end. While the others offer a passive change to the world, and otherwise you'll just be playing the game as normal, Iron Man systemically forces you to play with the specific goal of beating the game in mind. And that has a ton of potential to offer a unique experience and a potentially satisfying final moment of beating the run. But as you would expect from this title, it absolutely fumbles the execution of this idea, leaving it to be an utterly underwhelming experience. You see, the big failure of Lord's design that the Iron Man modifier highlights is the umbral buffer life mechanic, which completely fucks the balance of the game in every situation possible. This is something I talked about at length within my original video, which will apply to most things about this game. They really didn't fix much of anything over the last year, mostly because the game's faults are intrinsically baked into its core mechanics, such as the free umbral life, which changes the standard Souls idea of you die, you lose, get good, and replaces it with kill me once, shame on you, kill me twice, fuck you. The balance of the game becomes so skewed in that every boss fight or encounter needs to be dangerous enough to consistently kill you multiple times over per attempt, if it wants to come off as difficult at all. And as soon as the player overcomes whatever difficult aspect presents itself, the game becomes completely easy, because you'll always have the buffer life to catch you when you fail. This is likely why the game has so many encounters that throw a shitload of enemies at you, because it's much easier to design a difficult encounter, difficult enough to be capable of killing you twice, if there are tons of enemies attacking you from all angles. However, that comes at the cost of the game sucking ass, all for the sake of the umbral mechanics that could have just been implemented without the free life if the game was confident in its design. On the opposite side of the game being easy because of the massive room for error that the umbral life gives you, there's the moments where the difficulty spikes dramatically, because of the umbral puzzles or traversal moments where you're forced to forego the bonus life, just before having to complete fucking platforming while enemies spawn around you. The completely embarrassing implementation of the Iron Man modifier all comes down to how the Umbral plays into the idea of a deathless run. Every single potentially interesting, challenging moment throughout this run is thoroughly castrated by your bonus life, because there's nothing stopping you from just hitting your dark sign the second you die for the first time and enter Umbral, which gives you temporary iframes long enough to use your Moth. The Moth item of this game is the mechanic which mimics using your dark sign or memory of grace in Dark Souls or Elden Ring, which sends you back to your last bonfire at the cost of your souls. And sure, you could use the Homeward Bone variant that lets you keep your souls, but if you know you'll be going up against a dangerous boss fight, you can just spend your souls beforehand, and then you'll have an infinite source of death saves, such as in the instance where you're pitted against the Light Reaper boss fight, which is generously removed from the tutorial area, but must be beaten upon what would ordinarily be his second encounter. You'll likely be considerably less powerful at this point in the game than you would be when you would ordinarily be expected to beat him on his fourth encounter. And so, without even having played this fight in a year, I beat this fight on my first attempt of this challenge run because there was zero chance of me losing the run with this strategy at hand. This comes together to create a deathless run where you're allowed to die as much as you want within fucking boss fights. How the fuck is that a challenge run? Well, the real challenge of this run comes in the form of the moments where you're forced into the Umbral, such as the early game area Pilgrim's Perch, a good portion of which will force you into the Umbral at multiple points upon your first run through here. As well as that, the Perch is a distinctly vertical level with mini platforming moments and Umbral busywork. I didn't lose a single run because of any boss fight whatsoever while attempting this challenge, because it was impossible to lose in a boss fight. But I died like 20 times in Pilgrim's Perch. This shit is so fucking obnoxious, which is exactly what I should have expected from a poorly made game that jammed a deathless challenge run into itself without thinking about the actual realities of the design of their game. And those realities are, the real challenges such as boss fights are all jokes, and the real moments where you'll lose your run all come down to bullshit one-shots or failed jumps while in Umbral, completing which revolves around taking things incredibly slowly and cautiously during the uninteresting busywork Umbral challenges, and then blowing through the boring easy boss fights that have no bearing on the run whatsoever. The one exception to that formula is the fucking Hollow Crow fight, which encourages you to enter Umbral to fight it. But you can also just use lamp pulls to beat the fight, so the same thing applies to it anyway. Fucking thankfully, this fight is what I consider to be the worst boss fight in all of Souls, potentially in all of gaming. It is beyond insulting for the combat of the fight to be entirely made up of copy-pasted gank enemies, while the Hollow Crow itself is aesthetically cool but is a static piece of the world, acting like a less interesting version of the fucking bed of chaos. Utterly embarrassing boss design. I hate this fight. Honestly, playing this game again has given me such an appreciation for all the other Souls-likes that even remotely attempt to be made with quality design. It's like a palate cleanser for games made with a ton of effort. I should do a playthrough of this garbage before every Souls-like game just to remind myself how bad things can be. Anyway, the Iron Man is the real bedrock to any modifier challenge run that you might do, alongside any other modifier you might pair it with. While the rest are simple modifications to the base game and offer a similar experience to it, Iron Man is attempting to ask you the question, are you good enough at our game to beat it without dying? However, in reality, it unfortunately asks the question, do you know how to metagame our shitty design well enough to do so without dying? I'm so glad that I started using the word metagaming to express the sentiment of a game being difficult because it's bad. For a long time, I found it to be incredibly hard to express in simple words that something can be unacceptably difficult, yet still beatable by doing something outside of a developer-intended method. And to express that it is hands down a bad thing for the industry if failures of design in-game get patched by player intervention through exploit or otherwise. My biggest examples of this are all of DS1, Millennia's Waterfowl, and Radahn's pre-patch cross-slice, all of which I consider to be very poorly designed, yet can be successfully metagamed and exploited through. Don't get me wrong, I can appreciate a nice little exploit every now and then. I've cheesed Radon and done the elevator skip in the Halig tree countless times, but I think it's important to recognize when there are glaring flaws in game design, and not let the exploits shield you from those realities. You should appreciate the experience that metagaming gives you on a personal level, while still recognizing what the game is underneath the meta players have established. Developers shouldn't get credit for even positive experiences cultivated through their lack of design. It's like, sure, I'm hella glad that Alexander Fleming accidentally contaminated his samples and stumbled upon the wildly helpful penicillin. Me and the burning sensation I don't feel when I pee are thankful for that. But that doesn't mean that every scientist should be a sloppy fuck and hope for the best. And when it comes to developers being sloppy fucks, all that we have left to do is metagame in an effort to smooth out the experience. Whether that be using sound cues on the DS1 Rafter Painting Guardians to make them walk to their deaths, or the spin move on Millennia's Waterfowl, or whatever you chose to use against Radon's pre-patch slice. If the universally known answer to a problem is to metagame the challenge, then the challenge isn't really difficult, it's malfunctioning. And that sentiment is something I hold very important to me because I aspire to be a sort of people's champion when it comes to Souls games. No, I'm not the best in the world by far, but I seem to be one of the only people willing to put in dozens of hours into challenge runs and no-hits, only to then point out the critical flaws in boss design that might be punishing the less invested members of the player base, less interested in exploits and metagaming. I absolutely hate the idea of casual players muscling through tough challenges and feeling bad about themselves for being shut down by moves that don't actually have developer-intended methods to overcome. Especially so when those moves are later patched to be more player-friendly and a bunch of gatekeepers come out of the woodwork to complain about the game being made easier. Anyway, that whole rant aside, I'm glad that I've started using the word metagaming to describe these concepts because it directly highlights the problem. If you have to metagame something, then you're not even really playing the game at that point, the game as it was designed at least. And after grinding through the full modifier run of Lords of the Fallen, I'm convinced that the majority of the challenges within it were mostly solved with metagame strategies rather than overcoming true challenges. The answer to boss fights and world traversal is to dark sign out when you enter the Umbral. And the answer to Umbral puzzles is to take everything gruelingly slowly, killing any single ad that might be in your way before approaching a ledge or platforming section, and conversely, knowing when you're able to sprint through difficult sections of gameplay where the only danger is the powerful ads within it, potentially dealing with immense frame drops in the process. It's all so incredibly boring, and I couldn't say I would recommend an Iron Man run to anyone, even the few Lords of the Fallen fans that exist. I only completed the full modifier run for the meme's sake of this video, and I got absolutely nothing in the form of satisfaction in doing so. After 2 deaths and resets in Bramus Castle, the very last section of the game, which features several dangerous Umbral sections, I was thoroughly demoralized. Yet, wasn't going to let a shitty game stop me from completing its shitty challenge, just so I could justify my opinions that it's shitty without anyone claiming I couldn't beat it. And so I came back, shit on every boss, carefully addressed every Umbral section, and finished the game with the Gank Fight Yapsesh boss fight, which doesn't spawn its last ad until he's finished his speech. And the only feeling I have about the accomplishment was glad that I would never have to play this game again. Don't try this run. The next modifiers on this list I'll cover as one because they both suffer from the exact same problem of Lords of the Fallen's design. Randomized loot and pre-upgraded loot are fun plays on the Souls formula, and something that's frequently seen as a mod shortly after a Souls game's release. Again, like the Halo Skulls, it's a nice thing to have this be an option in-game, and is something I wish would be included in Elden Ring, alongside a boss fight coliseum to replay boss fights, such as in Sekiro, and also, would you look at that, Lords of the Fallen has included a boss replay feature as well. That's pretty nice. I mean, it would be if I gave a shit about any boss fight in this game. However, despite the randomized loot feature being a nice idea in theory, in practice Lords of the Fallen's base game fails to prop up such a concept in one huge way. That being, the loot pool in Lords of the Fallen is fucking terrible. There are thousands of potential drops in Lords, and almost all of them will either result in a meaningless passive increase, such as upgrade resources, or it will be one of the many weapons scattered throughout the game which all function nearly identically to one another, aside from minor differences. My final build, after failing several times, resetting to the tutorial, and gathering a massive pile of loot along the way, was a holy damage build featuring Pidia's lightsaber I purchased from the boss loot store, a spellcasting item I purchased from the first NPC merchant dude, and a holy infusion spell purchased from the same dude. I wore mostly armor I started with, and passively replaced pieces with whatever better random armor I found along the way. And the one randomized piece of loot that was of any note to me whatsoever, a single weapon which outperformed my holy lightsaber, was a fucking moldy pickaxe, which was only good because it had intrinsic poison damage which could be buffed with rune slots. And I think that speaks volumes about the abysmal state that the weapon pool is in. A random rotten pickaxe was more effective at dealing damage than the rest of my min-maxed holy build, including a fucking holy lightsaber. And it's not like the pickaxe is a gimmick where you're just cheesing bosses with it and then using it for its one function of poison in a specific way. It's a pretty decent melee option, because just about every weapon in this game is a pretty decent melee option, because they're all the fucking same. And I get that being able to dual wield a lightsaber and a pickaxe seems like it should be an interesting player-forward style of build crafting, where you'll have many options to choose from, but in reality it standardizes everything down to a basic melee form, sterilizing the combat and destroying the immersion. A pickaxe shouldn't be as effective as a lightsaber, and it definitely shouldn't be better than one purely coming down to access to poison damage, which is one of the most powerful status effects due to how much downtime mini-bosses have, and how boring mini-bosses are for it. And so, with a massive stockpile of weapons at my disposal, when thinking about what I wanted to dual-wield my main weapon with, I ended up looking at an inventory full of junk that only differentiated itself by either being giant class weapon or regular, and by whatever status effect they would trigger, and the obvious choice to add to my build became anything with poison damage, I don't fucking care what. As for the pre-upgraded loot modifier, it's nice, I guess, from the standpoint of not having to rely on the random loot to drop the correct upgrade materials, but again, there's not a lot of reason to change from one weapon to another, so it doesn't even come into play all that much. Sure, it's great to have fully leveled weapons drop after reaching level 100, mostly because you'll never then again have to do the busy work of unlocking the blacksmith, but there's not enough reason to ever change your strategies and build after you've reached that point anyway. I think this modifier would work better if it was designed to offer you higher level loot than you currently have, which might make you want to switch up your gear more often. But again, this would be a simple gimmick which would only serve to reveal how basic the weapon system is anyway. Now, the next modifier we have is the randomized enemy modifier, another that is often seen as a simple mod shortly after a Souls game's release. And this one has a really hilarious implementation because its major failure is the game only has 6 enemies. It is remarkable just how pointless this change is to the game, and just how little the experience changes from the base game. And let me explain why. You see, this isn't a full randomization of the game's enemies, likely because that would glitch out the game in one way or another. For instance, if a ruiner were to spawn in the tunnels of the sewer area, you would be pretty fucked and unable to pass it or fight it off with many other spawns around you. Instead, the game randomizes the enemies by class, roughly using the classes of small dog enemies, regular enemies, ranged enemies, major enemies, and the big boys. And so, with such a restrictive implementation of a random enemy playthrough, all you're left with is dog spawns where you'll see one of the 3 reskins of dogs, regular enemies which are mostly ignorable or melee spammable, ranged enemies which re-roll into a different color of this one boad, major enemies, 90% of which are bosses at one point or another, which all get re-rolled into a different skin of the tutorial boss enemy, and the 2 big boy classes, the Ruiner and the Duo Fight Big Holy Knight dudes. Almost every single enemy of a specific class in this game is dealt with in nearly the exact same way, such as tearing through the regular or dog enemies and dodging once behind any of the major enemies, which cancels their combos, allowing an opening. All of which results in the most benign randomizer run imaginable, and a hilarious reminder of just how sloppy and lazily this game was made. And that's all there is to it. Now, all of that is pretty funny and pathetic, but here's where the modifiers just start to get insulting. because the next one is increased enemy density, which is fine, I suppose, until you read the description, which says returning the original enemy density of the game's launch, parentheses pre-nerf. Now this actually pisses me off quite a bit for two main reasons, mostly due to the wording and the needless inclusion of mentioning the game's launch state. The first reason is that this is a fucking lie. The original enemy density was slightly higher, most notably within the ice reskin of the tutorial boss's fight. There was originally 3 ice wolves alongside the boss, whereas now there's only 2 on increased density. I'm fucking sorry, but I thought the words original density meant that the density was going back to the original state it released in, not the fucking, oh yeah, turns out our game sucks ass, so let's scramble to fix it with shoddy patches state it was in a month after its release. And you know, I get that on face value this isn't a big deal, and honestly the game is better off for it because original true density was ass, but I'm not the one who emphasized that this was original pre-nerf density. I didn't rewrite history to make myself look better in hindsight, which brings me to the second reason that this modifier pisses me off, which is, you can't just pass off your mistakes as a challenge run later on. That's fucking bullshit. That's having your cake and eating it too. The devs made those changes to the game because the game was worse before and needed adjustments to be playable with any amount of enjoyment. Making this a challenge run implies that players just weren't good enough to meet the challenge of your base game, when in reality your game just fucking sucked, and most players were able to realize that to a higher degree than they were willing to metagame the garbage challenges. It had embarrassing design, which they attempted to sweep under the rug by patching it and then bringing back later as a challenge run that nobody asked for, while quietly leaving the most shoddy encounters nerfed. Hexworks' dev team is remarkably incompetent, and this modifier attempts to hide that fact, yet highlights it if you take even a moment to peek under the covers. And you know what? It doesn't stop there, because I'm just going to roll into the other modifier which does the exact same thing. The vestige decay modifiers. There are several tiers of decay which I find strange. I feel like you're either all in on the concept because you're still glazing DS1's interconnected world, or you're like me and you think the concept adds mindless tedium walking through boring areas, especially Lords of the Fallen. I kinda get it in DS1. Either way, the concept was first used in Lord's New Game Plus and was later removed when players found it to be fucking annoying. I feel like I know the levels of Lords a lot better than most people, and even I get lost sometimes, especially so when backtracking. The consensus was that it didn't add much of anything to the game because the world of Lords just isn't that interesting to be forced into exploring thoroughly. And I would say that making it a challenge run doesn't help its case. The one instance where your run will fundamentally change is that you'll have to go through Pilgrim's Perch once more to reach the second big key-related area, the Abbey or something. The large skill set you'll learn to overcome this single instance of backtracking is simply to activate the 2 shortcuts, which means you'll never have to go Umbral on your return here, which significantly reduces the danger here, and that's about it. An entire challenge run skull that fundamentally amounts to some bonus walking and encouragement to hit shortcuts. It really makes me wish that these modifiers added some kind of extra layer of reward to their completion, like the bonus points you would get for Halo skulls. There is absolutely no reason to turn this vestige decay skull on whatsoever outside of one achievement, and that's within a game chopped full of collectathon achievements, which I would never even consider completing. I can't even be bothered to do that in Bloodborne, DS3, or Elden Ring, and I love those games. Actually, I may have done that inadvertently in Elden Ring just by playing the shit out of it, because it's worth playing, which is a huge fault in the total design of Lords of the Fallen's modifiers. Most of them were repurposed from the base game at launch, which wasn't worth playing in the first place. Okay, now let's just take a breather and take a look at the last modifier, which I saved for last because I think it's pretty cool actually, and at least a unique challenge instead of a repurposed one. Withered Healing, which must be recovered through dealing damage. The major failure of this modifier is that the whole game sucks total hot dick, and therefore, no matter how cool of an idea it is, it doesn't really matter when utilized within this title. But like I said, I'm trying to end on a high note, so let's push that to the back of our minds for now. Withered Healing, in a way, feels like Piccolo's weighted clothing. training you to not only heal within appropriate openings, but also have the confidence in the fight to shortly after be able to precisely deal damage within appropriate openings, before taking another hit of damage which would reset the process or outright kill you. This challenge run is like the training wheels that would someday lead you to a no-hit, because you'll at least to an extent have to master the boss's movesets rather than just struggling through. I mean, that's all there is to it, but it does fundamentally make the game less forgiving and more difficult, and that's pretty cool as a concept. Okay, this is coming off as a lot less optimistic than I was hoping for, so I'm just gonna lean into it. The real failure that this modifier highlights is that it just confirms how useless the deflection system is in Lords of the Fallen. If you're already dealing with the threat of withered health, then the last thing you would want to do on top of that is to miss a deflection and take more withered health, then miss a deflection worse and lose it all in one go. Especially so when dodging is easier, safer, ends boss combos, and will universally finish fights faster and with less investment. If you're going for a withered run, just commit to not deflecting anything except for moves you're very confident in and just want to flex with. And that's it. At the end of the day, these modifiers do nothing but prove just how lazy and incompetent Hexwork really is. They made a shit game, and after a year of updates, all they've managed to do is rearrange the shitty aspects of the game and pretend that it's new content. And I only just realized this now after reading a wiki page on the latest update. This is the final update to Lords of the Fallen. This is the final state that they're leaving the game in after fumbling through a roadmap of updates and then committing to a sequel. And all I can say in regards to hearing that is, I still want my fucking money back. At the end of the day, Lords of the Fallen has found its way into a special place in my heart. You know that place in your heart that makes your whole chest hurt, makes you feel out of breath, makes your arm go numb? I'm having a heart attack. My life is flashing before my eyes, and all I did my whole life was complain about shitty games and make videos about them. My life was awesome.